Thank you all for coming. My name is Mark Hansen, and I'm the interim director at the Center for Ethics here on campus. And welcome to the penultimate PEC Presents seminar series for this term. Just want to let you know that on May 2nd, the final installation will be Ellen Leahy, who is the health director from the Missoula County Health Department. We'll be talking about public health and the public negotiating the intersection. That's on May 2nd at this time. But today we're very happy to have Christopher Preston with us today. Christopher is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, and prior to that is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He has his BA from the University of Durham, England. Also want to mention that he's the author of the book Grounding Knowledge, Environmental Philosophy, Epistemology, and Place. That came out in 2003. He is currently working on a book called Philosopher Gone Wild, an intellectual biography of Holmes Ralston III, which will be at the University of Pittsburgh Press. He works and also has done work in commercial fishing in Alaska, worked for the Park Service in Alaska, and is the project tool librarian for the Missoula Urban Demonstration Project here in Missoula. So very happy to have him here, and Christopher will be speaking today on Can You Talk About the Value of Nature Without God?
Thanks. I wanted Mark to mention those last couple of things about the tool library and about Alaska, because though I have this training in philosophy, and a lot of the things I'm going to say are going to make me sound like a philosopher, I also want to ask questions that are very real questions for non-philosophers. So I hope there'll be various points in this where, just when you're beginning to get overwhelmed by philosopher speak, suddenly a real question will appear again. Because I think the title of the talk, Can We Value Nature Without God, is a very real question. It must be real because it was a subject of a lawsuit. Back in the good old days, when Mike Dombeck was U.S. Forest Service chief, and he made ecological sustainability and the sustainability of wildlife populations a priority for the Forest Service, they got sued. And the problem here was that apparently what the Forest Service was doing is they were embracing a religion, the religion of preservation. And of course, church and state have to stay separate, so the Forest Service was subject to a First Amendment lawsuit. Now, what actually happened in this case is that the lawsuit was dismissed, and it's quite fun, amusing actually when you see what the judge said. In a scathing decision against the attorney, the judge said the case not only lacks merit, but was intended to harass the defendants. And then the judge gave the gentleman who brought the case 15 days to argue why the court shouldn't impose financial sanctions against him for filing a frivolous lawsuit. So it worked out okay in that case. The Forest Service wasn't actually embracing religion. But the worry remains. Is it possible that to be a preservationist you are being religious? We were watching a tape in my class the other day, and a real estate developer said, if environmentalists would just admit that what they believe is a religion, then we'd have a lot more honest debate. So that was a little bit shocking. You don't have to look for real estate developers and attorneys filing frivolous lawsuits for this kind of viewpoint. No less an environmental historian than Bill Cronin, in quite a famous article he wrote about wilderness, suggests that wilderness serves as the unexamined foundation on which so many of the quasi-religious values of modern environmentalism rest. So in a number of places you get this suggestion that environmentalism is a religious movement. And I was interested earlier on this semester to read some of the letters in the Missoulian about the intelligent design debates. I don't know if you tracked any of those. There was quite an interesting discussion in the editorial columns and in the letter columns in the paper. And I came upon this in one of those articles, that some of the intelligent design supporters said of those who thought they were being secular and scientific about the environment, well, after all you're doing is embracing a non-theistic kind of religion. So in other words, even if you go about your environmentalism as scientifically as possible, it is still a religious type of commitment that you're making when you commit to environmentalism. So what I'm looking at today is, can you do environmentalism without ending up being religious? You may not feel the need to, or you may not want to particularly, but can you do that? And I just want to make clear right away that when I'm saying without being religious, I don't mean just without embracing a Christian God. There would be a number of ways in which you could base your environmentalism on some kind of religious commitment. You might embrace the concept of a world soul, for example, or you might embrace the idea of an animistic universe with spirits inside the universe. So any of these would be the religious bases for environmentalism that I think it would be interesting to see if we can avoid. Okay? Now why? Well, first of all, it would stop us getting sued. Back to that first slide about that First Amendment lawsuit. If we can for sure separate environmentalism from religion, then we're never going to get subjected to First Amendment lawsuits. If the government is preserving something, they don't have to worry about being accused of preserving something for religious reasons. The second reason is just a philosopher's preference. Those of you who studied some philosophy know that philosophers hate to take leaps in their arguments that require a faith-based movement. They like to be able to just sort of follow through the argument, solely resting upon rational connections between principles. And so it's definitely going to be a philosopher's preference to avoid religious arguments. And then I think there are also pragmatic reasons. If your environmentalism does not have to rest upon a religious commitment, then you don't have to worry about how you're going to persuade people who don't share your religion. You don't have to worry about being sort of parodied as being some kind of sort of romantic religious person who's just advocating something because they have a personal spiritual commitment to the environment. So I think there are some pretty good reasons to find some arguments for valuing nature that don't rest on God. Now, philosophers like to clarify the territory a bit, and I have one more piece of clarification I want to do. As well as finding arguments that don't depend upon God, I also want to set aside arguments that are instrumental arguments for valuing nature. And this is a bit of environmental philosophy terminology, but instrumental arguments for protecting nature would rest upon the idea that the environment provides certain valuable uses for us. So the environment's good for us because it helps preserve our health. When we've got clean air and clean water, it helps preserve our health. The environment offers recreational opportunities for us. The environment provides nutrition for us. It gives us clean air to breathe. The environment gives us aesthetic pleasure. All of these are instrumental reasons because in the end they parse out as the environment doing something for us. And so it's a use value that we ascribe to the environment. Even economic values at the bottom, they're all use values. And those can be excellent reasons for protecting the environment. But what I want to do today is focus on these other reasons for protecting the environment, intrinsic reasons. Reasons that don't have anything to do with how we might use the environment or how we might need the environment or how we might prefer to see the environment just as a matter of human preference. I want to look at intrinsic reasons where we find something about the environment that is worth protecting in itself. Now, why do I think it's important to find intrinsic reasons? Well, there are occasions where instrumental reasons end up clashing. And sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out which one to prioritize. Do you want to keep this forest for recreation, or do you want to use this forest for its wood products? So in those clashes, instrumental reasons sometimes are going to leave you scratching your head. There are also cases where we might want to talk about preservation where there are no people around. Antarctica doesn't have too many people around. The moon doesn't have too many people around. It might be an interesting question. How should we treat the moon? Should we leave garbage on there, or do we have an obligation to leave it as pristine as possible? And a third reason why we want to avoid those instrumental types of arguments is that sometimes human preferences change. We can't be sure that 50 years from now we're going to need nature in the same ways that we need nature today. So to sort of sum that up, if you can find those intrinsic reasons, you have a more commanding argument for preserving nature. It's one that you can sort of hang your hat on. It's going to be good for all time if there are intrinsic arguments for protecting nature. So this is all by ways of clearing the ground and giving some indication of where I want to head. I want a non-theological account of the intrinsic value of nature. Can we do this? Can we argue for value in nature without God? The first place you might want to look is with this happy trio, Emerson, Thoreau, and Muir. I mean, a lot of environmentalists point in this direction for their intrinsic arguments, their reasons for valuing nature. Now, I want to very quickly dismiss these three by suggesting that they actually take us off in the wrong direction. If your arguments for protecting nature rest upon some kind of capacity that experience with nature gives you to transcend the drabness of human life and to sort of raise yourself into some kind of connection with God. In other words, if you are an Emersonian transcendentalist, you've headed off in the wrong direction already, because you're not going to end up with a secular reason for protecting the environment. And I'll just read a couple of Emerson quotes just to sort of give you a sense of how he goes off in that direction. This one you've probably heard. It's a famous Emerson quote. "Books are for the scholar's idle times. When he can read God directly, the hour is too precious to be wasted in other men's transcripts of their readings." Okay, so reading God directly in our encounter with nature, that's why Emerson thought we should go out there. Thoreau is maybe not quite such a transcendentalist as Muir, but I wonder if he moves us, again, off in slightly the wrong direction. When I was looking over some discussions of Thoreau for this presentation, in Lawrence Buell's book, The Environmental Imagination, I don't know if anybody knows that book in here, the section in which Thoreau first gets discussed is titled Thoreau, Native American Spirituality, and Modern Neo-Paganism. All right? So just the way that's titled suggests to me that it's probably not the direction we want to go off in. Not that there is anything wrong with Thoreau, and not that I don't think Thoreau can give you very good reasons for protecting nature, but I think that the reasons Thoreau is going to give you are going to lean too much on the theological side. If they don't lean too much on the theological side, they might lean a little too much on the instrumental side. So the experiment at Walden was one that mandated simplifying our lives, mandated learning something about what was real outside of the sort of modern industrial paradigm. And in Walden, Thoreau has that quote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." So nature was supposed to encourage us to, encounter with nature was supposed to encourage us to be a little less caught up in the modernist paradigm. That's an instrumental reason. What about John Muir? Well, I love John Muir. No problem with reading John Muir for environmental inspiration, except it's just not as secular as you might hope it was. And there's no shortage of Muir quotes that indicate just how theological was his orientation. But I'll read a couple of them for you. From his first summer in the Sierra, "Every crystal, every flower a window opening into heaven, a mirror reflecting the Creator. Also in First Summer in the Sierra, in our best times, everything turns into religion. All the world seems a church, and the mountains altars. And he also says there, I've discovered that I also live in creation's dawn. So in those cases, we've got some great environmental sources, but don't they end up sounding a little bit theological, a little bit romantic? Don't they just take us off in the wrong direction? And this is where I want to be the philosopher here. And I want to say, there's nothing wrong with those. But if we're looking for a secular argument, if we're looking for a non-theological argument, let's take ourselves off in a slightly different direction. So instead of looking for what I've called there romantically informed arguments for intrinsic value, let's look instead at what I'm going to call scientifically informed arguments for intrinsic value. And I've thrown up a couple of names there of environmental philosophers who I think give arguments that steer us in the other direction, the direction we want to go. Arguments that don't end up at God's feet. Arguments that in fact rest on something more scientific. And I don't have a photograph of a Wisconsin marsh. That's actually a marsh in South Carolina, where I used to live. But I put in a couple of Leopold quotes there, just to give something of the flavor of Leopold. Now, I'm not going to say Leopold wasn't a little bit romantic, but what I want you to notice in these quotes is that there appears to be a real emphasis upon scientific processes that generate the value of nature. So when he's talking about the crane marsh up at the top there, he says the marsh wears a paleontological patent of nobility. I don't know if you remember the section about the crane marsh in the Sand County Almanac. But it's a beautifully lyrical description of evolutionary and ecological processes. A paleontological patent of nobility. The call of the crane is a trumpet in the orchestra of evolution. I mean, lovely language, but look at the science in there. You remember the keynote to Leopold's land ethic is that we have to preserve the integrity, the stability, and the beauty of the biotic community. And he's borrowing ideas from ecology there, the idea of a biotic community, which maybe 50 years before Leopold didn't even exist. I mean, the word ecology didn't exist more than 80 years before Leopold. So there's a heavy leaning on science in there. And the last quote down there, I think he's still talking about marshes that have held cranes in them. Those marshes are symbols of that incredible sweep of millennia, which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and men. So once again, that emphasis on evolutionary, ecological processes, they seem to root Leopold's land ethic in a way that's much more obvious than Thoreau, Emerson, and Muir. It's not absent in Thoreau, Emerson, and Muir, but it's more obvious here. Let's just look at a couple of quotes from the other gentleman I mentioned there, Holmes Ralston. Ralston lives in Colorado, so he's a bit more of a mountain guy than Leopold. But here are some of the things he says about systemic values in nature. He says ecosystems are storied achievements of natural history. When he's talking about the value we find in organisms, and he's trying to point out how that value depends a little bit upon what the organism is surrounded by. He says, though unity is admirable in the organism, the requisite matrix of its generation is the open plural ecology. He's got a lovely early essay about pasque flowers, and they're out right now. Has anyone been up to Blue Mountain recently? There's loads of pasque flowers out. And the pasque flower, says Ralston, helps me to glimpse something more. The skill of art superimposed upon the science of survival. His essay about the pasque flower is all about how incredible it is to see the past flower emerge out of the quiet of winter and the harshness of winter as the first flower of spring, sometimes emerging through the snow. And that is art, but it's superimposed upon the science of survival. It's the ecological process there that Ralston is impressed with. And then an earlier piece titled Hewn from This Cleft of Rock, where Ralston is admiring the geology that surrounds him. He says, "This walk has carried me backward 10,000 years at every step, and here I must rest, for I'm lost in the plethora of time." So what I'm saying about both Ralston and Leopold is that unlike Thoreau, Emerson, and Muir, they rest their case on things scientific. Now, if we want to value nature without God, seems like a good direction to go. Look for these things scientific that we are going to approve of in nature and we're going to end up valuing in nature. And so I want to put up a statement there which I think captures the thing that's driving Ralston and the thing that's driving Leopold here. And I want to claim that this is a secular, non-theological, environmental intuition. And it would go something like this: evolutionary, geological, and ecological processes operating since the beginning of time and having created a world of diverse and complex life forms must have some intrinsic value that's worth protecting. Okay, and here's where I want to kind of poke my face up from outside the philosophy and sort of touch base with philosophers and non-philosophers alike, and just suggest that I think this is a very common intuition that environmentalists across the board share. They may not say it quite like that, but it seems to be a widely held sense that there's something about what is out there, what's been appearing and emerging and continues to emerge out there, that is something that we admire. Something about these evolutionary processes. It's hard to say what it is, but it's something connected with what has emerged in nature that provides the ground of our valuing. And I'm going to suggest this is promising as far as finding the secular reason for valuing nature. So that appears to work, but if we're going to value those particular things, you have to ask yourself, why? You know, why would you value something just because it is complex? Or why would you value something just because it's diverse? Why would you value something because you think it's stable? I mean, you might like it aesthetically, but why does that necessarily mean that it has value? And here is the problem. This is how the philosophers characterize the problem. Those just appear to be aesthetic preferences. You know, we like diversity, we like stability, we like nature that appears to have a certain inexorable power to it. But those are just aesthetic preferences. The real fact of the matter here is that truths of science are totally separate from truths of ethics. So science just is. I mean, nature just does its thing. Evolution just operated in the way it did. And there's nothing there that demands that we should value it. It just is. Right? So I hope everyone's kind of following the point here. We could admire nature very much for all these qualities, but when we ask ourselves, well, why do we admire for those qualities? It's hard to find a reason, except that we have an aesthetic preference for it. And if it's just an aesthetic preference, then we haven't found an intrinsic value of nature. We haven't found something inhering in nature that we are going to admire. So we haven't actually got what we set out for, even though we followed the scientifically informed environmental philosophers. Let's look again at that list of values that we were hoping was going to give us reason to admire and value those evolutionary processes. We said they were powerful, they were complex, diverse, stable. They create life, they create richness, and they create wildness. And it looks like at least 90% of those are just aesthetic preferences of ours. One of them, though, I think sticks out. And which is the one that sticks out? You see it the same way I see it. One of those qualities about the evolutionary process sticks out. You would think that one sticks out, wouldn't you? These ones you could say, well, I know people that don't like wildness. Or I know people that find the environment too confusing, there's too much going on, they like a simple life. Or I know people that don't even like stability. I mean, there's a question about whether the environment is stable or not anyway. But just ignore that question for a while. Some people don't like environmental forces that seem too powerful. So all of those, you could imagine people saying, no, I prefer other things than those. But with that one, it seems like the argument has a bit more traction. It seems like there maybe is some reason to value what is life producing. So let me now try and capture that intuition. Even if some of our reasons for valuing natural processes are the results of subjective or aesthetic preferences, isn't the fact that these processes produce and sustain life something we should value? So having stumbled a bit on my scientifically based environmental ethic, I'm picking up a bit of momentum again. And I'm saying, all right, isn't the fact that these processes produce life, isn't that something that can have us genuinely, intrinsically, non-theologically value nature? Another philosopher says, but why? Why should we value life? Now, I think I stand a better chance answering this one than I did answering the one before. Why should we value evolutionary processes? I can think of a number of things I would say about why we should value life. Here's a start. And right now, I'm stopping being a philosopher. And I'm just putting these up here as arguments that appeal to me as a human being as to why I should value life. And I hope these ones, I'm going to have to probably explain a couple of them for them to make sense. But these are ones that I think a lot of us are going to think about when asked the question, why do we value life? The first one, because life is sacred. Oops, I can't use that one. That one's going to take me back down the theological track. So I want to say life is sacred, but I don't want to go down that track, because as soon as I've done that, I see these First Amendment lawsuits heading my way, and I've decided I want to avoid those. But these next three, these arguments from self-preservation, from otherness, and from the support of values, I think are a little bit stronger. And here's how these arguments go. Here's the first one. The argument from self-preservation. Since I myself elect to stay alive, it must be that I value life. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here. By that my daily actions, I show that I value at least my own life. Therefore, I should value other forms of life around me. That might work, but I don't think that it does work. We're now in the Roman Colosseum, where you can give the thumbs up or the thumbs down to an argument. I don't think this one will work, because the fact that I do value my own life, and I do, that's why I'm still alive today, that's why I avoided the cars on my bike ride in today. The fact that I value my own life doesn't really compel me to value anything outside of me. I might just be a remarkably ego-centered living being, demonstrating that I value my own life every moment of the day, but refusing to value any life outside of mine. So that argument for a life-centered intrinsic value ethic, I don't think is quite good enough. Here's another one, and all of these arguments have been used by environmental philosophers. Usually they say them in such confusing ways that it's hard to follow them, but another one would go something like this. Because we recognize the need to overcome an inflated sense of self-importance, humans should value the existence of a natural world that possesses lives, living beings, independent of ourselves. So somehow we can learn something in the face of nature, something about humility, something about an appropriate sense of ourselves. That's what life can teach us, and that's why lives are valuable wherever we find them. That one gets the thumbs down too, I'm afraid. And it gets the thumbs down for several reasons. One of those reasons is you could just sort of reject the premise of the argument that somehow we need to be more humble. Maybe we don't. Maybe we are appropriately arrogant. And maybe there is nothing that we can learn from nature because we don't need to learn anything about being humble. Maybe I could just march on through my life without ever noticing that there are other people around me or that there are other living forms out in nature around me. So I could just reject the first premise that I need to be more humble. Another reason why I should reject that argument is that it's actually an instrumental reason for valuing nature. If somehow it's going to be good for me to be more humble, then that's an instrumental reason for valuing nature. Like my quest at the beginning, do you remember, was to find something about nature itself that is valuable. And so if that's an instrumental argument, it's not the right kind of argument for me. And a third thing I could say about that is just purely from a practical point of view. You just don't see a lot of people going around saying, you know, being around living beings outside of me affects my behavior because I just feel compelled to be more humble. I mean, it just, at a very practical level, it just doesn't seem to be the way people think about nature. So that argument gets the big thumbs down. The last argument is the one that I'm going to say is the strongest of the three life-based arguments. And it's actually kind of the broadest, because it says, if it's the case that I value anything of any kind at all, now this doesn't have to be natural things. I might value my car, I might value my dog, I might value my house, I might value my new laptop, I might value my income. It doesn't have to be an environmental thing, but if it's the case that I value anything at all, then I must value the ecological and evolutionary processes that create the possibility of that valuing. Without those ecological and evolutionary processes, I would not be in the position to value anything at all. So given that I value anything at all, and I do value things, and we all know that almost as a sort of intuitive fact about our existence, we value things. We demonstrate that every step of every moment of the day. I must value the processes that make that possible. Now I'm going to give that argument, it doesn't get the thumbs up, because it's not a perfect philosophical argument. But it's going to get the, I think I'm okay with that symbol. So that argument is going to sit with me quite well. So this is actually where I end right now. And I want to sum up by saying that the point of the little train of thought that I've traced out here is not to say that theological arguments for protecting nature are useless and should be dismissed. Nor is it to say that instrumental arguments for protecting nature are unhelpful and should always be ignored. Quite the contrary. I actually think most of the time the most powerful arguments are going to be instrumental arguments. We need this clean water. Our grandchildren want to experience this wilderness. And also some of the most powerful arguments are going to be theologically based arguments. There's a creation here that we need to protect, or there's a wholeness, a spiritual wholeness to this planet that we need to reverence. I think those arguments are good arguments. But if you want to stay away from a theological basis, and if you want to stay away from instrumental bases, and you want to come up with a non-theological account of the intrinsic value of nature, this, I think, is all right. This argument can get you somewhere. So I'm now going to open the floor and hear some better arguments for non-theological valuations of nature.
Is that the prep? We have to come up with a better one in order to be able to speak?
You can speak. You can try a few hours. Yeah.
Well, I know, I just have some questions. I think it's absolutely fascinating, but I'm wondering if there's implicit a dualism that assumes humanity outside of nature, humanity outside of ecological and evolutionary processes. And I was curious because you have geological in there as well as something that values it. But part of what has led to the tremendous ecological richness, I think so many of we value, have been periodically geologically cataclysmic events that have radically reduced diversity for that time, such as meteor striking. Mm-hmm. And what is to say that I'm nervous about having the processes themselves being the location of intrinsic value, because how do we absent ourselves as agents in those processes? One could make an argument that we have been produced by nature, we participated in our very act. It's part of those ecological, those evolutionary, and those geological processes. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the evolution of what we value over time, how do we not know that our current human-induced distinctions, which I find horrifying, but are not a necessary and valuable process of producing whatever richness will come later?
Yeah. I'm not sure that what you're saying is affects too badly the kind of argument that I've given here, right? Because in some sense we are part of natural processes. I have never in my life managed to fail to obey a law of nature. I've tried hard, and I've jumped off rocks and hoped I would fly, but I haven't managed to do it. So I'm obviously part of those processes, and I know that a lot of things that I do, a lot of my behaviors are conditioned by evolutionary processes. A lot of my desires are evolutionarily conditioned inside of me. So I don't think to make an argument like this I need to have exempted myself from those processes. But I do think, having said that, when humans do environmental philosophy, or when they discuss whether they need to treat nature a little bit differently, they are stepping outside and saying, what might I do now, given the current situation, to protect things or to change the way history is unfolding? Should I maybe try and pass a law which will get more miles to the gallon in our trucks? Maybe should I do that? Or should I try and protect some habitat for the grizzly bear or something like that? So there is a sense in which humans do step out when they do environmental philosophy, and they say, how might I act that is different now? And I think we can accept that sort of partially in, partially out account of who we are, and then still successfully try and formulate arguments to protect nature. So I don't feel like what you're saying is true. We're part of nature, but I don't feel like that affects our ability to make cases like this and try and persuade people with arguments like this.
Well, I guess part of, and I don't believe what I'm saying, but except that I just need to put it out there.
You should always believe what you're saying.
Well, no, but I guess what I'm troubled on, my original training's in geology. Geologists understand 99.99% of all the species that have existed are extinct. Mm-hmm. Now, we probably have a particular attachment to those that aren't extinct in this current time. But what if we're talking about what's intrinsically valuable? What's more intrinsically valuable about things that just for whatever reason, happen to exist now? Mm-hmm. And by existing now may prevent something else from coming into existence. And so if we get rid of the grizzly bear, we get rid of all these things that radically reduce diversity, undermine ourselves in the process. Mm-hmm. Right? Don't we just have an aesthetic preference for what we happen to know because we happen to exist in this time as opposed to that being intrinsically valuable?
Yeah. It's almost, I guess the issue is, am I going to say I value the processes, regardless of whether they wipe out 95% of the life on the surface of this planet? Am I going to value those geologically cataclysmic events? And I think I do. And Ralston, says, I was speaking to him right after that tsunami, and he said, nothing wrong with tsunamis. Tsunamis actually are great in the sense that he sees the processes as being great. But I think you can ask, why? Why is that process great? And that's why I think you do find yourself compelled to pull in this point about life, they're great because in the long run, they've created life and they've created diverse ecosystems. And despite these cataclysmic events, Earth has always bounced back to produce more life. So I think you find yourself sucking in that point about life in order to make these arguments work.
There's one fault, and then I'll open up. But how are we different than from a tsunami then? How are we not also an agent of Earth that our actions, even though they're short-term, speaking of geological scale, catastrophic, but how are we different than one of those processes that also does that?
We can choose not to act based on principle. I mean, that's how we're different. I'm sounding like Kant. This guy's in my Kant class. He's going to recognize that. But we can say to ourselves, you know what? I'm not going to do that because, and then we have some principle on which to act. That's how we're different. Lady at the back there?
I'm having trouble accepting the inside and outside of nature argument because I feel like if we were inside nature, then we'd pretty much rely on the instrumental values, kind of to, in an evolutionary sense, maintain our own survival. But if we're outside of nature and having negative effects on these ecological, geological, and evolutionary processes, then wouldn't the logical conclusion be to hasten the end of human civilization and let sort of nature return to its course of managing these things in a more productive manner than how we're currently affecting them?
I don't think it follows we would have to eliminate ourselves. But it might follow that we have to modify what we're doing. If we value, we value life, we value our own lives. I value
But that's instrumental.
No, I mean, I don't. I just value my life, not for any particular use I put it to, or I just value my own life. I mean, I think I do. I wake up in the morning saying, I'm glad I'm alive.
But then everybody doesn't value their life, so it's not.
Well, that's right. There was a point in here where.
Or what about the zero population growth people, or?
Zero population growth people can still value life. I mean, they can just say you don't have to bring more and more people onto this planet.
But so then do you not value all life, just some life? You have to value all life?
You don't have to value all life. I mean, if you value, there's a very confusing point here which no philosopher has resolved. Peter Singer writes in his book Animal Liberation. I haven't quite figured out whether it is better to, if I do value lives where there is no suffering, whether it's better to just introduce more and more of those lives. So in other words, if you value life, do you have to maximize population, maximize the number of species throughout the world, just reproduce, once you've decided you value life, should we all go out and just reproduce as much as possible so that the earth is full of more and more lives? It's an odd argument, and it doesn't necessarily seem to follow that. I know I value my life. I know that because when I get up in the morning, I want to preserve myself through the day. I want to make choices that accord with my goals and things. I know I value my life. Nothing follows about me wanting to produce other lives today. I mean, that doesn't have to be one of my goals just because I value my own life.
I guess I still feel like maybe valuing your own life would be instrumental. The whole question of why am I living? What's the purpose? And then there's some reason.
It gets too deep for me at that point. Yeah, I mean, it does, really. I mean, I just want to take it as a fact that I value my life. And my dog, just want to take it as a fact that he values his life too.
Yeah.
I think one of the undercurrents that remains a problem is the shift from specific to general, like the word source. And it's the same problem in Marxist analysis where the individual life may or may not be as valuable as the big system. And that leap from specific to general is I think where the accusation of religion, non-theistic religion, comes from. And it's striking to me, I'm not sure that I have a resolution to this, but it's striking to me how that kind of rhetorical structure, it's a poetics really of more than a philosophy, of even Ralston moving to the requisite matrix or the plethora of time from his moment in nature. That's a leaping that some call a leap of faith. And it seems as though your sequence of really powerful logic is tremendously, I want to say, useful, is going to work against the litigation of church and state because the word God comes out. But I'm not sure it works against the intelligent design folks who will say you have an ultimate source here, that evolution is a religion. And it's that very language of the ultimate that makes me wonder if something about American pragmatism and William James and Dewey shouldn't keep us in these processes as without the assumption that we can get out outside.
So you were worried about when I went from, like when I made a statement like, I value my own life, so I must value the matrix that sustains it. You know, I make this leap towards something systemic that...
it's a cognitive jump.
Yeah. I think that is possibly a problem. You know, it's a jump. But I think a lot of ethicists over the years, when they were being honest with themselves, have said things like, it's impossible to determine ultimate principles. You know, there's somewhere where your argumentation has to stop.
That's the pragmatic.
And you just have to sort of accept something as being your sourse or something like that.
And incrementally refine it as trial and error proves it wrong.
Yeah, and Ralston, I actually wrote, there's a Ralston remark here which I think is very telling. When Ralston has discussed that, the matrix that produces life and the stories of life that emerge out of it, he says, philosophy can present no argument why these stories ought to have taken place. The best I can give you is good stories and hope you accept them for that. We can then begin to sketch nesting sets of marvelous tales. So, I give you the good scientific stories. Can I give you an argument why ultimately you should value those? Probably not. You know, I just want to give them to you and hope that you commit to those stories as good stories. And this is, I think, you know, you're right, it's a decent criticism that at some point you just commit to something as being of ultimate value. But when you do it this way, you do it through the geology and through the evolution and through the ecology, I don't think you're as subject to the accusation of being religious as you are if you just say in wildness is the preservation of the world or something like that.
Because you can claim a sort of empirical basis for the matrix of life.
Yeah, you sort of have a scientifically informed ethic, something like that. And when you suck in that remark about life, you have a scientifically informed ethic that connects to something that is intuitively very compelling to us. And that seems to it does a lot of the work for you. Maybe there's a little bit of religion sneaking in there, but it does a lot of the work for you.
And just getting back to the idea of choice and saying that we, as human beings, have choice, whether we multiply and, and value life so much that we create more and more of it. Isn't that in a way just that we have a more, what we might term, refined system of choice? Because nature in its checks and balances and natural selection, in a sense, could be called choice on a maybe more refined level than what we think of as our our thinking choice,
Yeah.
our conscious choice. Because nature will take care of those things on its own. Just because an organism can't make a conscious decision whether it's going to do this or not. If there are too many of them, things are out of balance.
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't you just kind of think our system is just more thought-based and
Yeah, you could, and that's...
instead of the dog eating its tail, and maybe nature's system is more refined.
Yeah, it's certainly a compelling argument that we're not radically different in kind from nature necessarily, just because we can do this in a classroom instead of doing it out in the wild. But there's a illustration that sometimes gets used in philosophy classes that sometimes it's very difficult to make a distinction between day and night if you watch day merging into night round about dusk. One moment it's day, and then you keep on watching, and somewhere down the line it becomes night. You didn't even see where it happened. I mean, it's similar enough that it's hard to know where it happened, but it happened. There is a difference. And, I think I would want to maintain that, let's say if I make a decision not to have children, and let's say I ensure that I will never have children, I think that is a decision that is quite different from the kind of decision that a non-human creature in nature is going to make. Especially if I make that decision based on concerns about population, based on concerns about human impact on the environment. So I sort of form a principle and I decide to not have children. And I do think that's different in kind. I think it's different enough from anything we could find in nature that it's worth noting for its difference.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. If people want to continue the conversation with Christopher, if he has time, I'd be happy to have you come forward. But please join me in thanking Christopher.